Thanks, Mark. Gotta collect myself. The day my mother was born, Monday, June 29, 1925, the earth trembled and shook. I mean it. The earth really did tremble and shake. I guess because there was a magnitude 6.8 earthquake in Santa Barbara, California that day. That's true. But also because my mother was born at Northern Westchester Hospital's new facility on East Main Street in Mount Kisco. This is how my grandmother, Louisa Amodio de Rosa, described the Mount Kisco of the 1920s. And I quote, "Across from the railroad station was a park where many people had picnics and children had a good time. On the corner of Mojer Avenue and Main Street was Abel's. It sold everything. There was a drugstore, an ice cream parlor, and a 5 and 10 cent store, and Smilkstein's clothing store on the corner of Maple Avenue and Main Street. There was a small movie house that showed silent pictures, and I went there often. There were just a few stores and a lot of trees. It was really country. I loved it very much." The last entry in my grandmother's unfinished autobiography reads, quote, "On June 29, 1925, my third baby, a girl, was born," end quote. My mother's parents had both emigrated from Italy as children. Her father, Luigi, came alone at age 17 to escape poverty and deprivation in his hometown, which had largely been destroyed by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 1906. According to the ship manifest, Luigi had $10 in his pocket when he disembarked. By all accounts, he was a scuffler, by which I mean he did what he had to do to survive. As a teenager, Luigi slept on the floor of a Mulberry Street barbershop where he learned to cut hair. By the time he met my grandmother, he was in his 30s and made his living as a barber and as a landlord in buildings he built with his own hands. He was smart, tough, and very old-fashioned. My mother always spoke of him with respect, if not exactly warmth. My grandmother, on the other hand, was a beautiful, sweet woman to whom my mother was completely devoted. She had emigrated to the United States in 1906 with her middle-class family because her father, the general manager of a pasta factory in Naples, was sent by his company to Brooklyn to manage a new factory built to serve the needs of the burgeoning Italian-born population of New York City. Before she was married, my grandmother worked as a seamstress in Lower Manhattan, a place she always called the city. The skills she learned stayed with her entire life and were passed on to my mother, who made all of her own clothes, and, when we were kids, most of my sister's clothes as well. My mother had to contend with her old-school father and her 4 brothers, Joe, Pat, Louie, and Frank. She was especially close to Joe and Pat, who throughout their lives were always good to her. Still, she regretted not having a sister. According to my mother, when her father said no to her, which apparently happened a lot, my grandmother usually fashioned some sort of workaround. When it came to money, however, that was hard to do because it was the Depression, and my grandfather kept a very tight control on the family's finances. So, in 1943, when my mother graduated at the top of her class from Mount Kisco High School, and some of you have heard this story before, she wanted to go to college. But her father, who despite his pride in the straight A's his daughter brought home from school, said college was certainly not appropriate for a girl, and in any event, he wasn't going to pay for it. This time it was my mother who fashioned a workaround. She joined the Cadet Nurse Corps, created during World War II to train young women to replace the thousands of nurses who had gone off to war. She got her nursing degree, and she didn't have to pay a dime in tuition. She even got a stipend. The war ended, she got a good paying job as a registered nurse, and that's how she put herself through college at Loyola University of Chicago. In 1951, when she graduated with a BS in nursing education, my mother decided she needed to see the world. Traveling alone, she sailed to Europe aboard a cargo ship and spent 6 months exploring a continent still recovering from the devastation of war. Some of you, in your many wonderful notes, cards, emails, texts, and phone calls have described my mother as fearless and unafraid. Yeah, no kidding. Next, my mother decided it was time to settle down, mainly, I think, because she was broke. So she returned to Mount Kisco after nearly 10 years away and got a job at the hospital. One day, while one of the town's most eligible bachelors was visiting his elderly father there, another nurse called my mother into the older man's room on a ruse. That's where my mother met Angelo, who would become her husband. Within months, my parents were married, and then in rapid succession, they had 3 children, Mario, myself, and my sister Louisa. Some of you have also described my mother as impulsive and spontaneous. Unfortunately, my dad's no longer with us, so we can't really get his take on this, but if he were here, he'd probably say, in his usual understated way, yes, your mother spent no more time than was absolutely necessary making important decisions. But he'd say, in this case, marrying me was the right decision, and it was the best thing that ever happened to me. Pop, I'd say, why did you wait until you were 41 to get married? Well, he'd say, I just didn't meet the right girl until then. No, you didn't, I'd say. My father, who took over his father's butcher shop in town and worked until he was 80, died in 2004 at age 92. In the last few years, my mother took marvelous care of him. According to my mother, my grandmother told her not to marry this much older man, even though he was an awfully nice guy, because my mother would end up as a young widow. My grandmother was never wrong, except this once. My parents were married for 51 years. My mother never regretted her decision. They were devoted to each other and to their family. I'd like to imagine that when they were finally reunited, some 17 days ago, my dad said to my mom, Emanuela, I'm so sorry you're here, but I missed you, and I'm really glad you're here. My mother never had a single idle moment, even at age 90. Not one idle moment. It would take hours to describe the many things my mother did during her lifetime. I'll just mention a few. She was the mother of 3 and the grandmother of 8. Christy, Leslie, Tom, Rose, AJ, Anna, Carolyn, and Ken, for whom she always had boundless love and the highest of expectations. Although she was pretty unhappy that all of her friends seemed to have great-grandchildren, and she had none, she was very, indeed outspokenly, proud of her children and grandchildren. Occasionally, she may even have taken credit for their accomplishments. But nothing made her happier than spending time with her family and giving them advice, whether solicited or not. A few years ago, in the ceremonial courtroom of the United States Courthouse in Lower Manhattan, my mother got to place a judicial robe on her son on the occasion of his induction as a federal judge in front of family, friends, well-wishers, and judicial colleagues. My mother thought she was proud of me, and she was, of course. But imagine what an honor it was for me to give my mother, the child of a destitute teenage immigrant, the experience of participating in such a grand and dignified event. Outside of seeing my own children born, having my mother perform that function was the highlight of my life. My mother loved the opera. For many years, she would go to the Metropolitan Opera House to see the productions in person. But in recent years, she would spend her Saturday afternoons at the movie theater in White Plains, watching the Met's live and HD productions on the big screen. She loved the operas, of course. But what she loved even more, I think, were the credits that ran at the end. Because when my sister's name ran at the top of the credits as producer, my mother would elbow the person next to her. You see that? That's my daughter. She's the producer. My brother, an engineer who's had a long and successful career in the steel and electronics industry, And I often say that my sister has the most interesting job of the three of us. Certainly my mother thought so. Outside the home, my mother always worked, first as a nursing educator and later as a hospital or private duty nurse. She helped out my dad in the store. She was the longtime director of the Mount Kisco Senior Citizens Program. She worked as an occupational health nurse at the huge mail handling facilities in Manhattan and Mount Vernon. She even sold real estate. In the middle of all that, she somehow found time to get her master's degree in recreation for the aging at Teachers College, Columbia University. My grandmother was less than thrilled that my mother was at Columbia at the time of the campus riots in the late 60s and early 70s. But my mother found the whole thing quite stimulating. My mother was always doing something with her hands. She was a great cook. She never stopped knitting, crocheting, needlepointing, quilting, smocking. She made clothes, scarves, jewelry, necklaces, and Christmas stockings. She painted pictures. Something arts and craftsy would catch her interest, and she'd say, "I can do that." And she would. She did decoupage, whatever the heck that is, and she made pottery. She blew out Easter eggs, or she made homemade backpacks. Sadly, many of those projects remain unfinished. To say the least, she wasn't afraid to try new things. She got a computer and figured out how to email and surf the web. She's on Facebook, for goodness sakes. One day, on one of her frequent trips to the Mount Kisco Library, a man she did not know asked if she'd be willing to pose for photographs that would be used by online and print advertisers to sell their products to senior citizens. All perfectly proper, of course. Apparently, he was looking for a photogenic woman of a certain age. Flattered, my mother accepted the offer. To this day, her picture keeps popping up on greeting cards and in ads for trust and estate lawyers and supplemental health insurance and the like. "Mom," I'd ask, "did you get paid for this?" "No," she'd say. "Why would I want to get paid? It was fun, and I like seeing my picture everywhere." She never really retired. She just didn't get paid for the thousands of hours she spent as a docent at her beloved Caramore Center for Music and the Arts here in Tacoma, and as a volunteer at Northern Westchester Hospital and in the thrift shop run by the Women's Civic Club. She loved doing these things, perhaps as much as her friends and fellow volunteers loved having her. She never stopped reading and critiquing books, an activity made much easier in her later years by her Kindle and her Nook. She was an avid, some might say fierce, bridge and mahjong player, which she played for keeps and money. Indeed, we found a 3-inch high stack of $1 bills in her house. Truth. We're not sure, but we think that was her mahjong winnings. She taught mahjong at the library. That I'm sure she did well. Whether she could also teach her competitive spirit, I'm not so sure. And she was a world traveler. She went to Europe many times, to Great Britain and Ireland, to Greece, Turkey, and Israel, to Hawaii, and even to Cuba, long before the normalization of relations with that country. How she did that, I don't know, and I don't really want to know. After my father died, she spent a month traveling through New Zealand and Australia, even renting a car and driving the length of both islands of New Zealand, which is about 1,000 miles. This was when she was nearly 80. She traveled all over the United States, most recently with my sister to the Grand Canyon and the Hoover Dam in her late 80s. She said she wanted to do that before she died, and she did. She loved art museums and galleries and visited them all over the world. Sometimes she brought home some rather curious works of art, curious to us perhaps, but beloved to her. And we're here today as guests of the Women's Civic Club of Tacoma, for which we are very grateful. My mother's involvement with the club made perfect sense. The club was founded in 1918 as a continuation of the Tacoma Suffrage Club, which itself was founded several years earlier to advocate for a woman's right to vote. Had she been around then, my mother would surely have been a suffragette and probably been the president of the club. Indeed, in her 80s, she was the president of the club, and by all accounts, she did a pretty good job. In fact, as my niece said earlier, my mother was the original feminist, and she was way ahead of her time on every cutting-edge social issue. whether it was women's rights, race relations, or even same-sex marriage. Like all members of the Women's Civic Club, my mother worked at the thrift shop in the basement of this building. The shop has a dual function. It sells quality donated clothing and household furnishings to the neediest members of our community, and it generates the funds necessary to support the operations of the club, such as donations to the library, the ambulance corps, and many other worthy local civil groups, as well as college scholarships for local high school students. Apparently, my mother was pretty famous among the volunteers at the thrift shop. One of those volunteers, Katie Bierbach, shared the following vignette with me, and I quote. It's like this. Early in my career at the thrift shop, I was on duty at the dreaded cash register. It was no surprise that I made a goof, but then how to correct it? Soon, I had 4 women surrounding me, and each had a different idea. And we were punching buttons and reading instructions to no avail. It so happened that Emanuela was just arriving, and she rounded the corner from the staircase with her coat on and handbag on arm. She saw the melee, strode over, reached across the counter, and without a word, hit the bright magic combo of keys and went on her way. The Lone Ranger riding through. And to Katie. My mother had many friends and even more admirers. Many of those friends and admirers are here today, and I know most of you, but what has been most remarkable, really remarkable since my mother died, is to hear from people who are complete strangers to us. One of those people sent a note to us entitled, quote, "The first time I met Emanuela Briccetti," end quote. And with her permission, I'd like to read it to you now. I started working as the business manager at the Mount Kisco Public Library 5 years ago. I was at the new job maybe 3 days, and in comes Emanuela. I was talking to the checkout clerks, and Emanuela pointed at me and said, "Who are you? Are you the new Terry?" I said, "No, but I'm the old Lisa." She grinned a little bit, and then I asked who she was. She said, "Emanuela, and I'm sure you'll hear stories about me." I said, "I don't listen to stories, I judge for myself." She then went upstairs, and a while later I saw her again. She said, "Are you a librarian?" And I said, "No." She waved her hand and said, "Well, then I don't need you." With a smile, I said to this feisty stranger, "Well, you may not need me today, you may not need me tomorrow, but someday you may need me, so you should be nice to me." Again, she grinned slightly, and I went back downstairs. A few minutes later, one of the desk clerks came to get me and said, "A patron wants to speak to you." When I came out, Emanuela was standing there and said, "Come speak to me." I thought, uh-oh, now I'm in trouble on my 3rd day here. She said, "What's your name?" I said, "Lisa." She said, "No, your full name." Now I'm thinking, holy moly, I'll never get a job again. I said, "Lisa Ann Graziati." She told me I was saying my name wrong. It should be Grazia Ade. I said, "I know that, but no one gets my name right now. Imagine if I said it the Italian way." She asked me if I knew what my name meant in Italian, and I said, "Yes, thanks be to God." She asked me where I came from, and I said I grew up in the Bronx. She said, "No, your last job." I said I worked at the Westchester Library System for 24 years. Her face changed as if she had something on me. She said, "Oh, really?" "Who was your boss there?" I said, "Mitch Friedman." She said, "You know Mitch?" I said, "Yes, I do." She said, "Well, what's his wife's name?" As if she were testing me. I said, "Paula." She said, "Well, what do you think of your old boss?" I said, "I loved him. When he left, the place wasn't the same." She then said, "You know, Mitch is my neighbor." I said, "How would I know that? I just met you." She grinned a little bit more, pointed her finger at me and said, "I'm going to ask Mitch about you and see if you're a good one or not." I said, "Go right ahead. Mitch will say nothing but good things about me, I guarantee it." A few days later, she came in again. The staff came to get me, and they said they'd been told to say, "Your friend, Emanuela, is here and wants to speak with you." When I went out, I said, "I guess you spoke to Mitch." And she said, "Of course. Did you think I wouldn't?" I asked if that was why she told the staff to refer to her as my friend. She said, "Yes." After that, every time she came in, we spoke. Our conversations ranged from talking about her weekend to her review of the movie or audiobook she had just brought back. She bragged about her kids and her grandkids. I talked about my family and my mom and grandmother, whom I missed dearly. She brought in her crafts to see if we liked them and told us if they were hard or easy to do. She displayed those crafts and also the Christmas stockings she'd made for her family and her future great-grandchildren. If we said we liked something she'd made, she literally took it off her neck and gave it to us right then and there. When I told her the purple scarf she was wearing was my favorite color, it was off her neck. It was off her neck and on mine quicker than quick. I told her I loved her button necklaces, and she told me one day she would show me how to make them, but we never got the chance. She was always running somewhere to do something. We laughed a lot. I cried once when I told her I had breast cancer, and I was scared. She said, "What? Were you going to be a bikini model?" That immediately turned my crying into laughter, and she gave me a pep talk, and I felt better. I'm so sorry for your tremendous loss and the monumental loss to the community in the Mount Kisco Public Library. I want you to know we all respected your mother, and we also liked her and look forward to her coming to the library. I feel very lucky that I got to speak to her shortly before she went into the hospital. I'll cherish that conversation. I will miss her, and we will all miss her at the public library. Lisa Ann's note captures the essence of my mother. She had little patience for pushovers, and she did not suffer fools gladly. She said what was on her mind and expected you to do the same. If you were her friend, she'd give you the shirt off her back. Lisa Ann figured out, pretty quickly, that the best way to make friends with my mother was to give as good as you got. Lisa Ann said she hoped her note would make us smile and laugh, but not cry. She got 2 out of 3 right. We smiled and laughed, but we also cried. We received hundreds of other notes after my mother died. We loved hearing all of your anecdotes. Here are just a handful of the words you used to describe my mother. Lively, smart, fearless, kind, creative, generous, enthusiastic, outspoken, inspirational, impulsive, pioneering, unafraid, unapologetic, unstoppable, unforgettable. Just this morning, I received an email from our lifelong friend, Patrizia Baroni, who lives in Italy. Here's what she said. "I think that life had a very hard time with Emanuela, who always lived it her own way, passionately, brilliantly, and untamed, to the fullest and to the very end. It is up to us to keep on teaching what has now become our legacy." Finally, I need to apologize to those of you who also attended my mother's 90th birthday party in June. I promised you then that when we reconvened for her 100th birthday party, I'd fill everyone in on the remarkable things she'd done over the last 10 years. Less than 2 months later, she was gone. But here's what really matters. My mother had a wonderful, amazing life. She had a profound impact on her family and friends, her neighbors and co-workers, and her community. She will be missed, but she will never be forgotten. Goodbye, Mother. God bless you.
Okay, wow. An extraordinary woman, an extraordinary man. Thank you all again for being here. We're going to finish up with Maggie singing Voce di Donna. I also want to mention that the Justin Williams on the piano. I'm sorry I didn't mention her. Let's have another round of applause, please. Thank you, everybody. Before we get started, when Maggie's finished, we have refreshments in the back. There's also some photos that you might be interested in looking at too. So please.
And the loop.
And the loop, yeah, the photos in the loop in the back. On the computer we have moving photos, okay?